I want to, in this talk, really cover, I guess, two main themes, and very much related, I think, to what how Glyn introduced this presentation. So I want to look in particular about the place of oil and the Middle East in global capitalism, to think about how this has emerged historically and also some of the contemporary patterns, because there's been some very significant changes in the last couple of decades regarding the Middle East and the oil energy industry in particular, its relation to kind of bigger global questions that I hope to kind of unpack a bit in this presentation. And then, secondly, obviously, to come to some of those questions that Glyn raised around how do we understand these relationships and their implications for the US role in the region, in particular, the US alliance with Israel, and also the Gulf states, which I'll be speaking to in some detail, as well as the ongoing war both in Palestine, but also obviously the US-Israeli war against Iran that is continuing. So I want to just begin by setting out some of the bigger kind of theoretical framings, and then come into some of these more contemporary political questions. So this approach to oil that I'm going to want to outline draws from my recent book called Crude Capitalism, which tries to present. It was written before the genocide. It was written before, obviously, the war in Iran. But this book attempts to kind of present a history of oil's place in capitalism through particularly the 20th century up until the current moment, and to think about the ways in which the oil commodity was connected to the development of both the capitalist world order under which we live, but also, in particular, the rise of the United States as the dominant global power, particularly after the Second World War. And the motivation for this book, this is not a book about the Middle East, and it's not a book particularly about the Gulf or Israel or anything like that. But obviously, these areas, these regions, these countries play a major role. It is an attempt to be a more global history of oil and its place in our world. And in particular, it's coming from a dissatisfaction with the way that oil is often spoken about. Those of you who work and read on these issues may be familiar with some of the kind of famous histories. For instance, there's a book called The Prize by Daniel Jurgen. We often speak also of oil as a curse, or in the words of the Venezuelan oil minister a couple of decades ago, who said it was the devil's excrement. And these kinds of ways of thinking about oil that really invest it with this innate power, as if oil itself, which at the end of the day is simply a black sticky goo, has some kind of innate enormous power over our lives. And what I try to do in this book is to say, well, actually, we need to think firstly about the social system that we live under, which is capitalism, and to think about what is it about the dynamics of this system that give and invest oil with this apparent power. So I begin the book by speaking about some of these features of our social system. For instance, the push to endless accumulation, endless growth, the speeding up of both the production and consumption of commodities that we face in a very inexorable manner in the current moment, the mechanization. To think about these kinds of logics or features of this social system and the way it meshes, if you like, with the physical properties of oil, its energy density, its portability, and so forth. So that's if you like, where I'm coming from. It's coming from a critique of a kind of a commodity determinism that typifies the literature on oil, or to use the framing of Marx, the commodity fetishism in the ways that oil is often spoken about. As I said, this is also meant to be a bigger history of the world market, and in particular the role of the United States within this. And in doing so, I try to think about oil beyond simply its role as a liquid transport fuel, as something we put in the form of petrol in our cars, but actually to think about the myriad of forms that oil take as it circulates. In particular, it underlies a whole range of petrochemical products, plastics and synthetic fertilizers, and other kinds of synthetic materials that dominate our lives and have become largely invisibilized when we think about oil as a commodity. We don't normally relate these products that surround us as actually derivatives of petroleum. And I want to come back to this in the context of the current war in a little while. And then the questions of food is a major part of this, the food systems, finance, and the role of the United States dollar, the US dollar as kind of world money or the international reserve currency, to think about all the ways in which oil was built into or embedded in the emergence of the contemporary financial system in these ways. And again, I'll come back to this point in the current moment in a second. So this is where the book is coming from, and that I'm happy to speak to this in further detail in the Q&A. But I want to turn now to some of the more kind of historical features of this, and in particular, its connection to the Middle East. So to think about this more broadly, we speak often of what's described as the coal to oil transition, which is where oil becomes the dominant fossil fuel around the middle of the 20th century, shortly after the Second World War. This moment you can see on this graph in 1950 is a moment where the red coal is in red here, and then orange is the oil commodity, and you can see oil really begins to explode in use through the 1950s and 1960s, surpassing coal around about 1960 or so, a position that it keeps through to this day. Now, one thing this graph illustrates is that the notion of a transition sometimes implies that one energy source is displacing the other, that it's one energy source is kind of taking over and the other disappears. And I think what this graph really illustrates very graphically is that that's not the case. These energy transitions are additive processes. In other words, oil is added on top of the coal coal as an energy source at this moment. It's not like oil replaces coal and coal disappears. And this is a very important feature of our energy system under capitalism. And I think it bears repeating in the current moment, because people sometimes or often speak of the green transition or the transition to renewables. And we can see here, I think very graphically, that actually energy sources tend to be additive, and that's the same. That's the case also with solar and wind today. Solar and wind are being added on top of a fossil fuel substrate. And in fact, last year was the world's largest production and consumption of oil, coal, and gas in human history. So this is something that bears repeating when we grapple with this question of the climate emergency. And we can also see the ways from this graph that the climate catastrophe really began at that moment of the 1950s. That's when we see the big spike and the beginning, this acceleration, or what scientists call the Great Acceleration, with the huge levels of carbon being emitted into our atmosphere from that moment on, when oil becomes the dominant fossil fuel. So That's the kind of energy shift that we can see. And as I said, this is not just oil in the form of a fuel, it's also oil where in that moment of the mid 20th century where oil becomes the basis of commodity production itself, in the form of petrochemicals, in the form of synthetic fertilizers, synthetic rubbers, synthetic fibers, these commodities that really underpin virtually all of commodity production today. And the other ways in which oil becomes really critical to our world is through the 1970s onwards, in which from that moment where we see oil in the form of financial surpluses associated with the sale of oil, really coming to underpin the nature of our global financial system. And again, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail a little later on. So in all these ways, there were two transitions that we can speak about in the 20th century. The transition to oil on one side, and also the transition to the United States as the dominant power, capitalist power, surpassing European colonialism, in particular British and French colonialism, in that moment of the middle of the 20th century. So, drilling down into this history a bit more, in particular, the place of the Middle East within this, we can see, of course, this turning point of World War II was very much a moment in which we see the anti-colonial struggles unfold in the Middle East, but also obviously more broadly in the colonized world. And we see in the Middle East region this moment where different national liberation and anti-colonial struggles start to challenge those colonial structures of particular of Britain and France, with Egypt, the Nasserist movement in 1952, Algeria, movements in the Arabian Peninsula at this time. And throughout this time, the weakening, if you like, of British and French colonialism and the coming to power of new nationalist, Arab nationalist, left-leaning in some cases, anti-colonial movements, who look towards some kind of national sovereignty, attempting to build and strengthen their own economies. Again, this is not simply a feature of the Middle East, it's something more broadly. Within this process, the question of oil in the Middle East becomes key, because the enormous quantities of oil that begin to be drawn from the region, especially after World War II, are a key part of enabling this transition to oil at a global scale, in particular in Western Europe, because it's at this moment that Europe's oil supplies become heavily dependent upon oil resources drawn from the Middle East, in particular from the Gulf region of the Middle East. And in fact, the Marshall Plan, the US reconstruction plans for Europe after World War II, explicitly forbid the export of American oil to Western Europe at this time, and really saw oil from the region, from the Middle East, as being a critical part of shifting Europe's energy system away from coal towards oil. So in this way, the Middle East and the kinds of legacies of European colonialism, but also the growing power of the United States in the Middle East region, becomes very much part of how the history of Europe begins to be written. In particular, the energy and financial histories of Europe begin to be written from the Second World War onwards. There's a meshing of these anti-colonial dynamics with the transition to oil, with the transition to the US as the dominant power. Now, skipping along to the later decades, we can see with the United States emerging as the dominant power in the region, the weakening of British and French colonialism in those first couple of decades after World War II, we see American power come to depend upon two main pillars. In particular, shortly after World War II, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf monarchies become a key ally of the United States. And the US, if you like, builds this relationship with the Gulf monarchies, agrees to support support the position of those monarchies militarily, provided that there is this alliance and an attempt by Saudi Arabia in particular, a promise by Saudi Arabia not to destabilize oil markets in the wake of the 1970s oil price rises, and also an agreement between the Saudi monarchy and the other Gulf monarchies to primarily recycle the financial surpluses that come through the sale of oil into the American market, whether that be through investments in treasury bonds or into U.S. Securities, equities, or through the purchase of American military hardware. And these relationships were forged in that wake of the Second World War, and became absolutely central to the way that the Gulf was integrated into American power in the wider region, particularly after, of course, the revolutions in Iraq and Iran that saw the overthrow of Western-backed monarchs in the Gulf, in these also oil-rich and energy-rich states. So the Gulf monarchies in particular come to play a very particular role in American power from this moment onwards. The other main pillar, and this is of course particularly after 1967, we see Israel and Israel's role after 1967 in beating back the Arab nationalist movements, in particular Nasser in Egypt and elsewhere. The US alliance built with Israel from this moment onwards as well. And this is where we can see the United States agreeing to fund Israel, to arm Israel, and of course give Israel kind of political legitimacy and political protection on the world stage. That last bullet point, I think, is quite striking. The fact that more than half of all UN security resolutions that the US has vetoed since 1945 have been those critical of Israel is itself very, very striking. So the argument that I'm presenting here goes against, I think, some of the ways that the US-Israel relationship is often conceived. In particular, what I am trying to say here is that we need to think about US interests in the region from the bigger perspective of the world system, from the bigger perspective of capitalism, energy, and the financial surpluses associated with oil, rather than seeing US policy driven by or determined by a lobby, a pro-Israel lobby, whether that be in the US or the UK or elsewhere. Obviously, I'm not saying here that there is no such thing as a lobby or pro-Israel organizations. Obviously, there are, and I'm sure many of us in this room have felt the pressure of those organizations. However, I think using the lobby argument as the explanation for the American alliance with Israel gets the relationship the wrong way around. And it's in fact a liberal argument because it explains the operation of of states, and in particular capitalist states like the US, through the presence of lobby groups, rather than through the interests of the American state itself, or the perceived interests of the American state, and the importance of the region in the bigger global order. So happy to speak more about that in discussion and this question of the lobby if it's important. So moving along, how have these things changed in the last few decades? It's really, I think, important here to think about these alliances between the US and these two major pillars I spoke of, the Gulf and Israel, and in particular, the ways in which American strategy has centered upon drawing these pillars together through normalization. I think there is a kind of a short-sightedness in the way that a lot of this is spoken about, this normalization process, and kind of thinking about it only in the context of Donald Trump and the Abraham Accords, rather than situating this in the longer trajectory of American interests in the region, and in particular, the ways in which the Oslo Accords in the 1990s really opened up and accelerated this normalization process.
Steve Little.
Firstly, with states like Jordan and Egypt, but then really in the background, the question of the Gulf and Gulf normalization being very a central part of what drove the Oslo Accords, accelerating, of course, with the Abraham Accords, and also the UAE free trade agreement with Israel that was signed in 2022. Now, again, how do we think about these shifts in the US strategy or US interests in the region in the bigger context of the global dynamics? And I think here we can see the question of a relative American global decline that again predates the current war or the last decade or so, but has been very much associated with the rise of China as a major industrial power, a major manufacturing center, and a major financial center over the last 2 decades. And if we look at what this means for the Middle East, we can see a very we can see a very striking shift in the ways that the Middle East is connected to the rise of China in this table here, which shows the share of world crude oil imports for particular regions and countries globally over the last 2.5 decades. So we can see in the early 2000s that United States and Europe took on about half of the world's oil trade. These are figures in percentages. So 50% of the world's oil trade went to the US and Europe in the early 2000s. China was only 4%. Now, if we look more recently, we can see a dramatic shift, eastward shift in the world's oil trade. Both the US and Europe share has dropped significantly, and China now takes in about 1 in 4 of the world's barrels of oil. Now, this needs to be understood as not just a zero-sum game. It's not like the world's oil was going westward and now it's just shifted eastward. This has also been associated with an overall increase in the global consumption of oil over this period, which we could have seen on that graph I showed earlier. So it's not as if there's been an absolute increase in the quantity of oil consumed globally through this 2.5 decade time period. But there has been a significant shift in the direction of the world's oil trade. And this is the key point to understand. The majority of China's consumption of crude oil, and we could see very similar pattern here for gas if we looked at natural gas, is coming from the Middle East region, in particular from the Gulf monarchies. So about 60% of China's oil comes from the region, from the Middle East. So the Gulf monarchies are the largest component, as well as Iran, with about 13% of China's crude oil imports, as well as Iraq. So we can see here the ways in which the Middle East was very intimately bound up with the rise of China, because China's emergence depended upon these energy imports, both oil, but as again I said, gas is very natural gas is very important in the form of LNG. So this shift in the world's oil trade was also associated with the rise of national oil companies in the Gulf, in particular, a company, Saudi Aramco, which is the Saudi National Oil Company, really over this period rose to be the world's largest oil company globally. Aramco today is its profits last year exceeded the combined profits of the five largest Western oil companies: ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Chevron, and Total Energy. So those five huge Western oil companies, their combined profits was less than the profits of Aramco last year and also the year preceding that. So we see Aramco is by far the largest oil company in the world today. Its emergence and its power was very much connected to this eastward shift in the world's oil trade over the last 2.5 decades. Now, the other thing that's been associated with this kind of east-east connections that we can speak about is a diversification in the ways that the oil industry is organized in the Middle East. So if we look at the Gulf states, they are no longer simply exporters of crude oil or LNG. Their companies and their economies have diversified down the oil value chain into other kinds of chemicals, into other kinds of petrochemicals, as well as other kinds of industrial activities. So this is actually a very important feature of understanding the current war against Iran and the potential implications of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, because we see here that many of these kind of critical chemicals and commodities that are essential to food systems, for instance, and to manufacturing systems globally, actually originate predominantly from the Gulf today. For instance, the question of sulfur, 45% of sulfur exports pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Sulfur is a critical chemical for the manufacture of phosphate fertilizers, as well as processing metals and other kinds of substances. Fertilizers more generally, nitrogen fertilizers, about a third of global fertilizers come from exported from the Gulf. So we can see the potential implications of this war in really hitting food systems more broadly, particularly food systems in the global south, with interruptions to fertilizer supplies, as alongside the question, of course, of energy price rises in this form. So this is an important part of understanding kind of the place of the Gulf in the global economy today. It's not simply an exporter of energy. It's also a critical center of these other kinds of commodities. So let me just wrap up, speaking a little bit more about the war and some broader concluding remarks. I think, obviously, thinking about where this war might be heading, I do think that in understanding the US motivation behind this war, and I'm not at all saying here that the US is going to succeed in this. However, I do think it's important to think about the U.S. motivations, U.S.-Israeli motivations against within in this war, within this bigger global picture, and in particular, a long-standing attempt by the United States to push back or to reassert its presence and its primacy in the region in this context of a relative global decline, in the sense that the Middle East is a critical part of China's rise and the kind of challenge that China presents to the United States at a global scale. And the energy sources from the region, if you like, do present an Achilles heel for the Chinese economy. And it's very clear in China itself that China has seen this, or has been planning for such an eventuality, not necessarily this particular war, but the general eventuality through the building up of huge levels of oil stockpiles over the last few years, as well as an attempt to diversify its energy imports from Russia and elsewhere, as well as, of course, accelerating the rollout of electricity, renewables expansion as well, in an attempt to kind of ameliorate or deal with this potential weak spot. The other part to this, of course, is the question of the Gulf and the Middle East, not simply as exporters of material commodities or energy commodities like oil, but also, as I pointed out earlier, the financial surpluses that arise with this, and the fact that the majority of those dollar surpluses that accumulate in the Gulf continue to flow to the United States, and play a very important part in the U.S. Financial dominance and the ability of the United States to run continual deficits as they have done for the last few decades. So it is not accident, I think, that the first place that Trump has visited in both his first election and his second election out of the US was Saudi Arabia. And it's not just a question of the oil resources of this region, it's also a question of what happens to these financial surpluses and their continued flow to the United States, whether it be through direct investments or through the purchase of American military hardware. And in fact, the Gulf is the largest consumer of military hardware in the world today. About 20% of the world's military exports go to the Gulf region, and the majority of these are US-made weapons. So what does this all mean? I think this is kind of the bigger picture, and obviously what the US is attempting to do is to push back against Iran as the kind of key ally of China, and if you like, opposition to some of these tendencies that I've spoken about in the region, attempting to weaken, in particular, Iran's network of regional allies, particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon. Whether this will be successful or not, I think it remains an open question. It's clear that the United States is not able to defeat Iran in the way that it tried to put forward in the early days of this war. It is also clear that the closure and the continuation of this war does present a grave threat, I think, to other parts of the global South for those reasons that I outlined earlier around food and energy linkages that tie the Gulf to food systems elsewhere in the world. I think a big part of this is what will happen with the US Gulf relationship, in particular the questions of normalization with Israel. It is clear, I think, the UAE has accelerated its connections and relationship with Israel in the last month and weeks. Saudi Arabia it is less clear, but it still appears that these two key Gulf monarchies remain very deeply embedded in U.S. Military structures and the U.S. alliance in the region. And I will just end on this point that I think a big question here will be what happens to the regional reconstruction in the wake of the war, not just in the Gulf region, but obviously also in Gaza and in Lebanon, where a quarter of the population has been displaced and huge swathes of the country have been reduced to rubble. So I think we need to very much keep an eye and an analytical focus on what the directions of this post-war regional reconstruction will look like, and to really think about this in the context of, if you like, war by other means. The kinds of reconstruction plans we see being advanced from the Trump administration that involve deepening the normalization between the Gulf and Israel through the Board of Peace, which is very clearly an institutionalization of this normalization. We can see plans like the IMEC in Indian Middle East corridor, which the map on this graph or this map shows, which attends to link again India, the Gulf states, Israel with Europe through the imports of energy as well as other kinds of commodities. So there's a lot of these kinds of plans that are floating around, and I do think we need to think about the any eventual deal, which I don't think is going to be something very permanent or stable in the light of these potential reconstruction plans that are being discussed and advanced at the moment. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.